Should I take the GRE or the GMAT? An age-old question that is asked by GMAT and GRE test takers everywhere. Now, you might be new to these exams, or maybe you've already taken one of them. Either way, in this video, I'm going to give some important tips on how to consider whether or not to take the GMAT or the GRE. Now, also, if you've been involved in the exams for a while, maybe it'd be helpful to watch our videos on tips to improve your GMAT score or tips to improve your GRE score when retaking either of those exams, because perhaps maybe making the switch isn't something you need to do. As always, I'm Jeff Miller here with Target Test Prep, excited to jump in. Let's jump into some key points and considerations when thinking between the two exams. Consideration number one is how the tests are scored and the adaptivity of the exams. The GMAT, well, that's question adaptive. The GRE is section adaptive. So let's go to the GMAT to start. How you do on a particular question in the GMAT affects how you see the next question, the next question, the next question. That's question adaptivity. On the GRE, how you do in a whole section affects how you'll do in the next section or what you'll see in the next section. But it's quant and quant, verbal and verbal, meaning how you do in your first quant section affects how you see the next quant section, and then the same thing for verbal. So you've got to ask yourself, am I someone who likes dealing with question adaptivity? Or if I get a few wrong, I feel like I can get them back in the next couple questions? Or am I someone who would rather just be able to deal with the section as a whole? Doing well in that section means I see another higher level section in the next one. These are things you have to think about. I've worked with GMAT students for 15 years and GRE students for 15 years. Some people really appreciate the question adaptivity of the GMAT, and some people, when they take the GRE, feels like the pressure is a little bit off dealing with section adaptivity. But that's something to consider when deciding between these two exams. Consideration number two, the structure of each exam. So look, the structures aren't that much different at this point. Both of those tests have gotten shortened recently. Well, kind of recently. In the past year or so, they've gotten shorter. The GRE is just about 2 hours. GMAT is about 2 hours and 15 minutes. GRE has one writing section, 2 verbal, 2 quant, and of course the GMAT is broken up into 3 sections, quant, verbal, data insights. Now, there's no break in the GRE, there's 1 break in the GMAT. Could that be a consideration? Yes, but if you practice the way that you're going to actually take the exam, perhaps that break won't matter. So you could consider the structure of the test as maybe reasons to go for one test or the other. But like I said, they're not totally different. I think content is obviously a much bigger deal. The way it's scored, much bigger deal. And as we'll talk later in the video, whether or not you actually need one test versus the other for school. But yes, consider the structure of the two exams when considering whether you should take the GMAT or the GRE. Consideration 3, content, and we'll start with quant. So the content is actually pretty similar between the two exams. They will test things like algebra, quadratic equations, combinations, rates, work. There's a ton of carryover, and even the data interpretation section of the GRE, which deals with a lot of graphing, actually kind of bleeds in a little bit into what's tested in the data insights section on the GMAT with graphical interpretation. But there's some noticeable or notable differences. The first one is the GMAT does not have geometry. So if you hate geometry, maybe the GMAT is a decent place to land when it comes to dealing with quant. The GRE, of course, does have geometry, so that's one major difference between the two. Otherwise, the content, the types of questions and that you can be asked from a quant perspective are pretty similar. But then it boils down to question types, all right? So we'll start with the GRE. The GRE has 4 question types in quant. They've got your traditional multiple choice single answer, which is literally just A through D, pick an answer. They also have multiple choice multiple answer. What that is, they could have a number of answer choices, say 6 or 7 even, maybe 3 are correct. You have to put all 3 correct or answer all 3 correctly to get credit for the question. Then there is numeric entry, which just means instead of picking a multiple choice answer, you're actually inputting a number as an answer. And then finally, they have the classic quantitative comparisons. That's when you have a quantity A, quantity B. You're trying to figure out which quantity is greater, or if the quantities are the same, or if you don't have enough information to determine a consistent relationship between the quantities. Now, do you have to get those down specifically for the GRE? Of course. It's 4 different question types. It's a lot to deal with, but they're not that radically different. Now, we go to the GMAT. GMAT obviously has the multiple choice question just as the GRE, and then one other type of math question. But here's the kicker. This other type of math question is no longer in the math section. It's in the math section called Data Insights, which has another layer of math type questions. First of all, we will say that first question is data sufficiency. If you remember the classic GMAT, that was something that they had. That's where you have 2 statements and you try to figure out if either of those statements can answer a particular question with sufficiency. That's specific to the GMAT and tested in Data Insights. Now, what's also in the Data Insights section is those graphical type questions that we talked about in the GRE, plus a type of question called 2-part analysis and also table analysis. So pound for pound, I would say the GMAT does have a broader scope of what they can test you in the math section, making that math section a little bit more difficult than what you would probably see on the GRE. Now, does it mean you need to rush to the GRE and take that? No, not exactly, because there may be components of GMAT math that you do well with versus the GRE. And we're going to talk about this at the end, but obviously the best way to make this determination is by taking practice tests of both, which we'll discuss. So yeah, those are the differences between the content tested and the types of questions tested. So again, another consideration when deciding between the GMAT and the GRE. Consideration 4, verbal content. So what's the differences? What are the similarities? Well, here's the good news. They both test critical reasoning and reading comprehension. So you got that on the GRE, you've got that on the GMAT. And in fact, on the GMAT, the entire verbal section, the one verbal section, is just made up of critical reasoning and reading comprehension. Now, there's some verbal tucked away in the data insight section in questions like MSR questions and even some of the 2-part analysis questions. But the majority of the verbal is going to be in that one verbal section. Now, the GRE, it's not just critical reasoning and reading comp. And this is where there's a big crossroad between the GMAT and the GRE. So the GRE has a lot of vocab-based questions. Sentence equivalence, text completion, etc. You have to have a really good handle on your vocab to do well in that section. Now, if you're someone looking at the GRE and you say, man, my vocab just isn't where I need it to be, I don't think I'm going to be able to memorize 1,000 questions. Well, at that point, maybe you tip the scales a little bit towards the GMAT, right? Because that's not so vocab-based, and it's really just based on critical reasoning and reading comprehension. But that's a big decision you have to make because, yes, understanding, dealing with vocab is a big chunk of what's going to make you successful in the GRE, whereas you don't need that necessarily for the GMAT. Consideration number 5, and this isn't really about easier or harder. This is about where are you applying to school. So let's start with this. If you're applying to a full-time MBA program, let's say, well, in years past, people used to say, well, they like the GMAT more than the GRE. Well, at this point, I don't believe that's the case. I've never heard that from an admissions officer. Heck, reach out to admissions if you're wondering. It's always a good policy to hear it from them. But from what I can tell, there's not a big difference between GMAT and GRE of how they're viewing you as an applicant. So that's even Steven. You're not going to choose it based on that. But how about where are you applying, right? If you're considering maybe MBA programs and also graduate programs that only accept the GRE, well, then it's simple. You take the GRE because that's going to give you more flexibility in where you're applying. If you're considering maybe MBA and also Masters in Accounting, where Masters in Accounting only will accept the GMAT, again, the choice is simple. You take the GMAT. So you got to really figure out where you're applying, give yourself the best options for success, and then choose the test based on that. Again, if you're just applying to an MBA program, then perhaps it can still be either GMAT or GRE. But again, these are things you want to research before starting your prep. Consideration number 6, and this is big, you got to figure out which test is best for you. So of course, this video is about which is easier, which is harder, which is better. I've given you a lot to think about. It's a personal thing. So what do I tell students who are in this situation? Students who are starting out or students that have even been studying for one exam and considering switching to the other, take an official practice test. In fact, if you want to learn more about taking those practice tests, you can check out both of our videos on incorporating GRE practice tests into your prep and incorporating GMAT practice tests into your prep. And we also have diagnostics you can take for either one of those. But a great thing you can do is sit down, take an official GMAT, see how you do, look at your score. In your gut, ask yourself how you did. Sit down, take an official GRE practice exam, see what your score was. Again, in your gut, ask yourself, how did you feel you did? Then you take a step back. You take a bird's eye view of this and you say, which exam am I going to be most successful on, considering that I can take either one for my MBA program of choice or whatever it is, wherever you're applying, as long as they're not telling you to take one over the other. It comes down to you, how those practice tests went, and how you're feeling overall. And to be honest, that's how you're going to make the decision of which exam to take. Yes, you can ask friends, you can ask colleagues, you can go on forums. People are going to give you their opinions. But at the end of the day, there's not a clear-cut answer of which